Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm Freya Hartzell, Associate Professor of the History of Modern Design here at Bard Graduate Center. And on behalf of myself and my esteemed colleague, Catherine Whalen, I'd like to welcome you tonight to our lecture in our Modern Design History seminar series. It's a true pleasure for me to introduce our guest this evening, my dear friend and fabulous colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Otto. Dr. Otto is director of the Humanities Institute and professor of modern and contemporary art history at the University of Buffalo, State University of New York. She's also the author of scholarly articles and books, including Haunted Bauhaus, Occult Spirituality, Gender Fluidity, Queer Identities, and Radical Politics, 2019. Tempo Tempo, the Bauhaus photomontages of Marianne Brandt, from 2005, and together with Patrick Rüssler, Bauhaus Women, A Global Perspective. She's the recipient of many grants and fellowships, including from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the Getty Research Institute, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, among other institutions. This past summer, she co-curated the exhibition Bauhaus and National Socialism, which was shown in 3 locations in Weimar, Germany, where the Bauhaus got its start. She's currently working on a book about the Bauhaus members who stayed in Germany during the Nazi Third Reich, and we'll be hearing material from that project this evening. I just want to say before I hand the mic over to Libby that I have admired her work for the few years that I've known her, as both brave and innovative. And it's work that needs to be done, and I can't imagine a better person to do it than Libby. So thank you. Thanks.
Thanks for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I know there's a lot going on, and I just am really grateful for a crowd to present this to. It's material that means a lot to me, and I hope you find it interesting. I look forward to our discussion. In April of 1939, Alice Glaser sent her 17-year-old daughter, Marianne, away. She was leaving their home in Berlin, Germany, on a long journey. Alice gave her daughter a gift to take with her, a beautiful deck of cards for a matching game known as Animal Quartet that Alice had made herself. The deck is a menagerie of 13 sets of animals. Some, such as birds, fish, and dogs, are categorized taxonomically. Others, like tropical animals and domestic animals, large and small, are grouped by their habitats. Within the deck, each card presents a lovely or adorable individual creature for contemplation. That each belongs to a set is always clear. In addition to naming the animal in red, each card gives the group name in green and lists other members in black. We know then that parrot belongs together with woodpecker, yellowhammer, and goldfinch. Zebra, charmingly rendered almost exclusively through his stripes, must find his way to giraffe, camel, and elephant. This thoughtful gift expressed care for Marianne in several ways. It considered her well-being. The game would have helped her pass the time, and because quartet requires at least 3 players, she would have had to make some friends on the weeks-long ship's crossing to Bolivia. As a compact packet of portable artworks, it offered a tangible object enfolding memories and a connection to her artistic mother. And it thoughtfully anticipates Marianne's new life in her new country and the possibility of future grandchildren. Indeed, Marianne was leaving Germany with her boyfriend. 2 years later, after settling in Argentina, they married and subsequently had children. Although Alice Glaser and her daughter never saw each other again, they exchanged letters until, on November 14, 1941, Alice Glaser was deported by the Nazi government to Minsk ghetto in Belarus, where she perished at an unknown date. The Animal Quartet is now the most complete extant artwork by the Bauhaus painter, interior and graphic designer, and photographer Alice Glaser. It is also the most tangible connection that Glaser's family has to her. Thus, in addition to its original functions as game, artwork, and gift, it now serves as a memorial, something sacred, wherein its unsuspecting animals each carry a bit of the pain of her loss in the Holocaust. Because family members had invested so much meaning into the cards, the deck was not shown to anyone outside of the family for decades. But after 2 years of conversations during my research, Glaser's granddaughter recently decided that it was time to share the new animal quartet with the public, and I can now show it to you and tell Alice Glaser's story. One aspect of the violence of National Socialism with which historians are still coming to terms is the regime's partial or total erasure, not just of its victims, but of their accomplishments and their lives, their works and their biographies. Glaser is one of a total of 24 Bauhaus members murdered by the Nazi regime in ghettos, concentration camps, and prisons. An additional group of victims of the regime are the as yet uncounted number, at least a dozen, of those Bauhaus members who survived time spent in the camps or in hiding. While they were alive, these persecuted artists and designers often used their Bauhaus skill sets in new and unexpected ways, akin to the actions Glaser took in creating a game for her fleeing child. As I will explore in my talk today, Bauhäusler, as all Bauhaus members were called, it's a kind of nickname. Bauhäusler created novel and innovative works that resisted the regime's genocidal policies or that bought them protection within the unforgiving world of concentration camps. Excavating exemplary histories allows us to see very different manifestations of Bauhaus skills than have ever been considered within the space of the movement. Germany's Bauhaus is widely regarded as the 20th century's most influential art, architecture, and design school. It is also celebrated as the archetypical movement of rational modernism, considered famous for bringing together functional and elegant design and sharing that with the masses. It existed from 1919 to 1933, the same years as the Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy. And because of its progressive and sometimes controversial nature, it was forced to move several times. So in the map on the right, you can see its 3 locations. My current book and exhibition project is reassessing the history of what happened to the Bauhaus movement once the historical school was shut down in 1933. With a few notable exceptions, particularly in the work of Winfried Nöringer and Paul Betz, historians of the Bauhaus's legacies have most often promoted the idea, based largely on accounts of a few prominent members who were driven into exile in the United States in the 1930s, that the Bauhaus approach was sustainable only within the framework of liberal democracy. Such histories focus on those Bauhaus exiles who globalized the movement by bringing progressive modernism to Israel, the UK, and above all, the US, where at Black Mountain College, the new Bauhaus, and Harvard University, they trained a generation of renowned artists and architects. Meanwhile, in Germany, these narratives assure us the Nazis closed the Bauhaus in April of 1933, and thereafter, Bauhaus art and design were officially denounced as degenerate, and to be known as a Bauhäusler proved only a liability. Following this logic, then, conventional narratives of the Bauhaus's global imprint tie it to the development of mid-century modern design and the rise of a progressive art pedagogy. The truth was, however, more complex. This talk comes out of my book project, Bauhaus Under Nazism, Creativity, Collaboration, and Resistance in Hitler's Germany, which examines Bauhaus artists and their aesthetic practices within Germany and annexed lands after Nazi authorities shuttered the school in 1933. Counter to those narratives that focus on a decisive transatlantic break between Germany and the US, I look instead at the vast majority of the Bauhaus's known members who remained in Nazi-occupied Europe. In the book's second half, from which I draw today's talk, I zoom in on how aspects of Bauhaus practice, aesthetic approaches, and pedagogy endured in direct proximity to the violence of Nazi concentration camps, war, and genocide, but also how some Bauhäusler worked against the regime, or they created small glimmers of hope and healing in the face of the cruelties of Nazism. So this evening, I take up the task of investigating what Bauhaus did and became within the darkest spaces of life under Nazism, in the hands of those Bauhäusler who were trying to escape the regime or were already in its clutches within the regime's vast system of 44,000 sites of incarceration. In this talk, I focus on the surviving traces of the life and work of three particular Bauhaus members: Alice Glaser, who I've already introduced a bit, Lotte Rothschild, or Rothschild is how we'd say it, and Richard Grune, all victims of the National Socialist's exclusionary and genocidal policies. I've selected them each as illuminating a previously unconsidered aspect of the encounter between Bauhaus members and institutions that were among Nazism's most violent concentration camps. Glaser and Rothschild, both Jews, were murdered in the Nazi ghetto and concentration camp system. Grune, a gay man, barely survived a decade of internment in some of the most notorious concentration camps, including Sachsenhausen and Flossenburg. Collectively, these three are compelling examples of what I consider to be the Bauhaus's missing archive of Holocaust victims, largely unaccounted for in understandings of Bauhaus design's reach. Once they were deported, most or all of the work they made at the Bauhaus and in subsequent years was destroyed. Yet scant but important archival traces did survive, often preserved by family members and friends. These traces include documents, photographs, private memoirs, and occasionally a work of art, like the new Animal Quartet. It is notable that the creations around which I focus this talk are all works on paper, a material that was still to be had even as other supplies grew scarce during wartime. As a medium of bureaucracy, it was also ubiquitous in Nazi Germany. Bringing these artists back to the Bauhaus conversation has required substantive forensic work, and I've drawn on restorative methods pioneered by Saidiya Hartman and Taya Miles, among others, to redress the historical violence and archival shortcomings through close and contextualized readings of often meager traces. I sometimes turn to conjecture and consider adjacent materials, related objects made by other artists, for example, that can partially stand in for destroyed objects, taking care, though, to distinguish, in Carlo Ginzburg's words, truths from possibilities. Uncovering and investigating these artists' missing archives offers, I think, a form of justice because it restores to history three all but unknown Bauhaus members whose work and lives were largely erased by Nazi violence. It also allows us to examine how three creative individuals reacted when faced with increasingly impossible circumstances. As we shall see, perhaps surprisingly, in these examples of creativity in extremis, Bauhaus art and design often was made and given as a gift, gestures of generosity and kindness. So let us return to Alice Glaser. She and her daughter moved to Dessau together in 1928 after Glaser divorced her husband a year earlier. Alice Glaser studied there for 3 semesters at the Dessau Bauhaus. Her first, the spring of 1928, was as a visiting student in the preliminary course, the Bauhaus's signature introduction to creative thinking and practice, which she completed as a properly enrolled student during the winter semester of 28 and 29. She then joined the printing and advertising workshop led by Jost Schmidt, with whom she had studied already in the preliminary course. Here I show you 2 examples by another student held now in MoMA because Glaser's work from this time does not survive. I apologize for the quality of this image. It was kindly taken by a family member and I can't get better access just yet. So I think you can make it out though. While Glaser's workshop production from the Bauhaus doesn't survive, samples of her photographic practice at the time do, and they survive in another gift she sent with her daughter in 1939, an album of these photographs. A page labeled Dessau 1929 with Andreas Burkhardt in the preliminary course is one of several that Glaser devotes to her and her daughter's time at the Dessau Bauhaus, which had already been shuttered for seven years when she assembled the album in 1939. This page spread features two photographs in a stark modernist layout. The left one captures a scene unique to the known visual archive of the school, for it documents a Bauhaus student who was also a mother, together with her young daughter. Mariana was 7, together at work in one of the Bauhaus workshops. Glaser and Mariana are seated side by side in the sunny workshop space, each deeply absorbed in her work, likely drawing. Glaser may have taken the photograph using a self-timer. She appears ethereally blurry, captured in movement. Mariana, wearing a smock, is bent close in concentration on her work. The clearest figure is behind them, their smiling friend and Glaser's fellow Bauhaus student, Andreas Burkhardt. In the right photograph, a plucky Mariana appears in stark profile, her shiny bob cut tousled by bedhead. Not only do these photographs capture Bauhaus scenes, they utilize Bauhaus methods, drawing on the format of Joseph Alper's album pages of the same period. Photo albums presume an oral tradition. They are props for collective show and tell, as Martha Langford has argued. In their first viewing, Glaser and her daughter probably went through the album together and talked through the memories of each page. Subsequently, Mariana would have showed it to friends and, over time, to her own children in Argentina. As David Eng has observed, family photographs related to historical trauma move beyond photography's usual perceived alignment, quote, with the archive, with the evidential, and the documentary, end quote. They may be particularly imbued, he writes, with, quote, the affective dimensions of disappearance and loss, close quote. So it was with this album. In addition to its original function of capturing Mariana's happy childhood and their time at the Bauhaus, it became imbued with questions about why Alice Glaser did not leave Germany too when her daughter did. In the fall of 1929, after 3 semesters at the Bauhaus, Glaser returned to Berlin, where she supported her daughter and herself as an interior designer and eventually returned to her roots in fashion by opening a branch of a business called Chemnitz Stockings in her apartment. As a member of the Wertheimer family, which owned a large department store in Chemnitz, she had grown up in the world of fashion and ready-to-wear. Even under Nazi rule, as things became increasingly difficult for those like Alice Glaser classified as Jews, she continued to run the business until 1940. Given her background, we can see more of her life and work woven into the animal quartet. A box for a pair of stockings, as I show you here, served as the exterior protective case for the deck of cards. Inside that, the cards had a proper case, which has been squashed here. So you have to imagine that red thing as the top of a box. It's had a rough time from a conservation point of view. So inside, they were in a proper case with a handwritten label. Here, Das neue Tierquartett, or the new animal quartet. Alice Glaser decorated the backs of the cards by hand in a pattern of yellow, white, and black stripes. Once the box is opened, the cards blossom in color. The group members in red and black, and the group names in green. The cards are clearly carefully planned out, but they often have a sense of humor. The dogs in particular seem very lively, each with his own personality. The insects are more staid, meticulously drawn observations, enlivened only by their colorful backgrounds. Lanky Giraffe is also playful, crowded onto his card, but some animals appear more like generalized types, almost as if they were copied from images in books or magazines. And my supposition is just that, for although Glaser lived not far from Berlin's beloved zoo in 1939, she could no longer have visited to observe the animals in her animal quartet menagerie. The previous year, in early November 1938, Jews had been banned from the zoo, a ban strengthened following the November pogrom, often referred to as Kristallnacht, when Jews were banned not just from the zoo, but from all public cultural sites. The set also shows signs of the artist having to rush. The cards of the series Monkeys doesn't have as much color or its full labeling. Owl, from the series Nocturnal Animals on the right, still has its pencil guidelines, and she only managed to make 2 of the cards. Still, Glaser made 50 of these cards before her daughter left, and this is now the most substantive art and design work that exists by her. This portable artwork, a zoo that was always open for its visitors, stands out in Bauhaus history as an extraordinary gift of motherly love and an imagined future that in part did come to pass. I want to turn now to Lotte Rothschild, the second of the 3 artists I will address this evening. Introduced just prior to the September 1st, 1939 invasion of Poland, the rationing of items like fuel, meat, and textiles was a harbinger of the war. It became the norm in occupied France too, starting in June of 1940, with the South coming under occupation and its regime of rationing in November of 1942. This particular card that I show you here is a clothing and textile rationing card that was issued in the village of Pibrac near Toulouse. The cards contained points to purchase specific articles. A blouse cost 20 points and a winter coat 100 points. Expensive, given that this card only had 168 points in total and had to last for a family for 16 months. Rationing made feeding and clothing a family, jobs that often fell to women, extremely challenging. This card was issued in November of 1943 when, as fashion historian Irena Gunther has noted, such clothing cards had become nearly worthless for most women. There simply was no clothing to be had. And yet, this specific card still had value for its owner, Charlotte Flocon. For a while, at least, it did much more than clothe her family and her. It saved her life, because this card is a fake. In fact, it belonged to Lotte Rothschild, not Flocon, a metal designer trained at the Bauhaus who, a German Jew, was hiding in plain sight. Having forged papers like this certainly helped. This unspectacular document was still a piece of the occupier's bureaucracy. Thus, it lent authenticity to the identity as a Swiss Gentile that she assumed in 1943, and it kept her safe. It was only when she was betrayed to the secret military police, essentially the Gestapo in France, by a fellow member of the resistance in June of 1944, that she was deported to the French internment camp of Drancy, and from there to Auschwitz, where she was murdered in August of 1944, one of 8 Bauhaus members to die there. The ration card was made for Lotte Rothschild by her friend from the Bauhaus, the graphic designer turned forger Moses Bauhilfer. He had many names, so he is known as Bagel, which is written bagel in France now, in case you've ever heard that name. He, like Rothschild and her husband Albert Menzel, also a Bauhaus member, were active in the resistance in southern France, where Bauhilfer worked forging documents. The real art, as his friend Menzel later recalled, was in the beautiful stamps that Bauhilfer created. The document here would not have had to be created from scratch, which would have been extremely difficult. They may sometimes have been able to obtain blank cards to fill in, but often they chemically removed markings on existing cards, filled them in again, and created the appropriate local stamps. This is where Bauhilfer was particularly useful. Bauhilfer studied at the Bauhaus for 4 years and received his diploma in advertising and painting in February of 1932. Usually, anything made by a Bauhaus member can be considered as part of the movement. And yet, to my knowledge, items like this have not yet made it into Bauhaus histories. But they should. This is Bauhaus graphic design under duress. And it fits into the Bauhaus tradition of elaborate gift giving that dates to the school's earliest years. And while Lotte Rothschild didn't create it, it is Bauhaus design that matters to her story because it is one of only a very few objects of hers that we have left. The Bauhäuslerin Charlotte Josephine Rothschild Menzel, Lotte or Lo to her friends and family, and later Lotte Flocon to the authorities in occupied France, achieved many things in her 34 years. Because of the insecurities of the last years of her life, none of her art or design work survives. But materials that allow us to imagine and understand aspects of her life and work do exist. These then allow us to restore at least parts of her life and work to history, and thus to counter the legacies of Nazism's eradication of Jewish individuals and their achievements. Just 19, she entered the Dessau Bauhaus in April of 1929. She inspired several photographers, as here in Werner David Feist's study of her beauty, and also a Bauhaus exercise in form and texture. The next photo is a nude, just so you know. Another friend, Ethel Mittag Fodder, took a magnificent photograph of her bathing outdoors. Shot heroically from below and against the clouds, Rothschild is both timeless in her unashamed nudity and spectacularly modern. Engrossed in washing herself, as the blur of her right hand attests, she has bound her short hair in a jaunty polka-dotted kerchief and wears a wristwatch around her slim wrist. And I'd like to say she has a surviving daughter who I was like, is it okay for me to show naked pictures of your mom? And she was like, she was a modern woman, go for it. Mittag Fodder also photographed Rothschild and Menzel as a modern couple, intertwined, mutually supporting, and deep in conversation. What began as an affair at the Bauhaus would be the defining partnership of her life. Already a leftist at the Bauhaus, she joined the Communist Students Group and probably the German Communist Party. We have only general outlines of her Bauhaus activities. Rothschild completed the basic course in one semester and entered the metal workshop in fall 1929. Metal was one of the most male-dominated workshops at the Bauhaus, despite the fact that until the previous summer, its head had briefly been a woman, Marianne Brandt. Of the 11 women who enrolled to study metal, Brandt is the only one to obtain her degree, and even she suffered from discrimination. The workshop was collaborating with Leipzig's Candom lighting firm to design mass-produced lamps, a necessity as increasing numbers of homes and businesses were electrified. Surely Rothschild worked in this area. In his certification letter of July 1930, then Bauhaus director Hannes Meyer noted that, quote, Miss Lo Rothschild is particularly well suited to the metalworking trade. She has a talent for drawing and, during her studies in the metal workshop, was particularly interested in designing lamps. Rothschild also joined the school's experimental left-wing theater collective, the Young Theater of the Bauhaus. Formed in 1928 and heavily influenced by Soviet agitprop, students in this group worked collectively to create political pieces focused on contemporary events. 1 year into her studies, Rothschild was immersed in the powerful collective energy of the communist Bauhaus and had become one of its public faces. At the end of her second semester, on April 15, 1930, Meyer, the director of the Bauhaus, wrote to her parents of his concern that she had tuberculosis. He was wrong, and he also had no medical training, so I don't know why he did this. But he did, and she was sent home, and the result was that this was the end of her Bauhaus time. She made her way to Berlin, and Menzel, her later husband, joined her soon, as he had been expelled from the Bauhaus as a communist. From August 1, 1930 through the end of the year, Rothschild worked for the Goldschmied and Schwabe lighting company in Berlin, where a number of Bauhaus people were employed, until she lost her job in the ongoing Great Depression. In their letter of recommendation for her, the firm's directors praised her skill in lighting design, noting that during her employment, Miss Rothschild solved all assignments, both formal and technical, completely and independently. Miss Rothschild also worked independently in our propaganda and advertising department in numerous cases made very good designs. Many of our shop window decorations originate from her. For this photograph of Goldschmied and Schwabe's window, taken possibly while she was there, it is possible but unprovable that she had a hand in some of the lamps shown here or in the window system of interchangeable multicolored panels. Rothschild and Menzel married in 1931, and their daughter Ruth was born the following year. Here I show you a photograph of Menzel with one of their children. I'm pretty sure this is Ruth because of who was where when. And it was taken by Willy Jungmetag, who also plays an interesting role in another chapter of my book because he's one of only two Bauhaus members who went into active armed resistance and was executed for doing so. Already in February of 1933, within weeks of the Nazi takeover of the German government, Menzel and Rothschild moved to Paris, since as communists they were in danger in Germany. In France, they had two more children. With the outbreak of the war in the fall of 1939, Menzel was forced to enlist with the Foreign Legion. For almost 2 years then, Rothschild was alone in Paris with her three small children, working as a translator for the airplane manufacturer Lotte Corps, I think is how it's called. After Menzel was demobilized, she put their belongings, presumably including her design work, into storage and traveled with the children to the south and to Pibrac. There, too, she was the family's main breadwinner as a technical translator for the aircraft manufacturer Sud Aviation. As the situation became more dangerous, Rothschild contacted a cousin to help her family emigrate to the United States, but he was unable to help. In 1943, Rothschild and Menzel, who were anti-religious, had their children baptized, and then, for safety, sent them away to school or into hiding. And this brings us back to Rothschild's acquisition of fake papers. Created probably in the fall of 1943, these papers kept her safe until June 20th of 1944, when she was given up as a Jew by a resistance member she and her husband had sheltered. He was being tortured. She was arrested at work by the German secret field police, and after their interrogation, she and her husband, he was picked up as well. She and her daughter Ruth then, after the interrogation, were sent to Drancy concentration and kind of collection camp. As a native German speaker, suddenly back in a German institution, Rothschild became the spokesperson for her dormitory room. One day, she stood up to the camp's notorious head, the Austrian SS man Alois Brunner, when he had slapped a woman in her room because she didn't make her bed properly. Rothschild said to him, "I didn't think a German officer could slap a woman." And he said, "I will get you." This small bit of moral courage indeed cost her dearly. Brunner had her put on the list for the last major transport to the east, which, even under Nazi law, was illegal since she was married to a so-called Aryan, which offered her limited protections. Further, Brunner asked her to decide whether her daughter Ruth, considered a half-Jew in the eyes of the regime, should go too. And here the story is taken up by Lily Segal, a German Jewish resistance member who was also in Drancy. For 2 nights, Segal tried to convince Rothschild to leave Ruth behind, as Allied forces were sure to be there soon. Indeed, 3 weeks later, the camp was liberated. Rothschild insisted, though, that she could protect her daughter as long as they stuck together. On July 31st, 1944, Lotte and Ruth were deported to Auschwitz. Segal, who was on the train as well, testified that they were in a freight car with orphaned children, probably of their own choice, to help them. Segal writes, all the occupants of these cars were sent directly to the gas chamber upon arrival at Auschwitz. Their official date of death is the 2nd of August, 1944. When Menzel gave up waiting for Lotte and Ruth in Toulouse and returned to Paris with their two surviving children in 1946, he learned that because he and Rothschild were considered Germans, their belongings in storage, including Rothschild's Bauhaus work, had been seized or sold. In subsequent years, Menzel, rejecting all things German, began to use the name Flocon. It was his wife's chosen name on her forged papers after Rothschild and Menzel, her final last name, and the one that almost saved her. So I turn now to the final artist in my talk today, Richard Grune. In the picture I show you here, a man in vaguely 18th century clothing strides across the page, a shovel hoisted over his shoulder. The ground beneath his feet is a snippet of music, and from the context, we can see that this man is not only walking, but singing. The music indicates that he is one of the Moorsoldaten, or Moor soldiers, of the protest song composed in Bürgermoor concentration camp and brought to Sachsenhausen when it was founded together with transferred inmates, where Bauhäusler Richard Grune made this drawing in the winter of 1939 to 40. It's just one page of an entire book of text, songs, and drawings made in that winter by Grune, who was an artist and graphic designer who studied at the Bauhaus from 1922 to 23. The book's illustrations show hardy, happy men as knights, troubadours, and hikers carousing through landscapes and cozy villages. They enjoy the good life that the book's audience, prisoners of Sachsenhausen's Block 14, was daily denied. Here, for example, the song An Alley for Freedom tells of a knight, bright and good, who strikes down his enemies. Would that I was such a knight, goes the song. These figures are clearly stand-ins for the audience of this book, the male inmates of Sachsenhausen. The pictures are crowd pleasers for concentration camp inmates. It is one of the most unusual audiences for an artwork that I know of. Fellow inmate Harry Najux, Sachsenhausen's camp elder, recalled the book's making. He writes, that same winter, at the instigation of Robert Ulbermann, 2 songbooks with drawings by Richard Grune were written in the standing squad of his block. The standing squad stood closely packed in the washroom. In the far corner, Richard Grune worked huddled on the floor and thus escaped the view of the SS men who haunted the block. The inmates used the book for what they called their Schallerabende, or sound evenings. After days spent in forced labor, during which the SS often compelled inmates to sing, according to Inge Lamel, the prisoners gathered in their barracks and sang their songs voluntarily and with fervor, songs they knew from the workers and youth movements and from the Wandervogel scouting movement. The fact that the men in the upper left in this picture appear to carry bedrolls and walking sticks is important. Robert Ulbermann, who Harry Najux testified commissioned the book, was the founder of the Neuruppiner branch of the Wandervogel scouting movement that incorporated his fascination with medieval knights and castles. One of the themes that crops up repeatedly are romantic relationships with women, as on this page to illustrate a Plattdeutsch song, That You Are My Dearest. As on the right, the book includes the tasteful, even somewhat joking suggestion of sexual relationships with women as well. That this theme emerged from Grune's pen is noteworthy because, as Grune indicated in his Gestapo interrogation, he had never felt any desire for women and was indisputably gay. Grune's fellow inmates were keenly aware that he was a so-called paragraph 175er because he wore its unmistakable mark, the pink triangle, which is what people were in the concentration camps on charges of being homosexual had to wear. It's different in different camps, but that was the case in Sachsenhausen. And in fact, the songbook makes more space for queer desires than is initially evident. Pages for a song called Beyond, that I show you here, show a reclining knight and his squire with eyes locked, seemingly moments before a passionate kiss. This is in the lower left. Grune incorporated such imagery not only for his own pleasure, but for his audience. Obermann, the block elder who commissioned the book, was himself a paragraph 175er, as were most of those in Block 14 in late 1939 when the songbook was begun. Grune's songbook contextualizes queer desire within a vision of a free and pleasurable world, and it testifies to a period of time when gay inmates in Sachsenhausen experienced more agency and acceptance than is generally known of their histories. This window of time closed within a few months of this book's completion. In the spring of 1940, most of Sachsenhausen's gay prisoners were transferred, as Grune was, to Flossenburg concentration camp in April, where he remained until the spring of 1945. He survived Nazi imprisonment longer than most. That he was a socialist helped, but Grune's greatest protection was his artistic skill, valued not only by his friends who sang from the songbook, but also by members of the SS who ran the camps. In Flossenburg, Grune survived by working in the SS painting commando. If we look back, though, to 1922, Grune arrived at the Bauhaus aged only 19, a moment full of promise for the young artist. In one of her progress associations, his harmonization teacher, Gertrude Grunau, noted that Mr. Grune still requires some time to gain greater peace in the world that arises in Weimar and at the Bauhaus for him. His powers, however, seem certainly able to become remarkable, close quote. It is possible, I think, that Grunau sensed that her student was coming to grips with his sexuality as a young gay man. He left the Bauhaus after one further semester, so a total of two, when he was still deemed unready for workshop specialization. A committed socialist, Grune worked as a graphic designer, and in 1927 he became artistic director of the Social Democratic National Working Community's first summer camp. Dubbed the Children's Red Republic because it was self-governed by the children, I imagine it was terrifying. The Seekamp camping ground near Kiel hosted 2,300 children from working-class families. Grune and another artist from Kiel, Niels Brodersen, worked with the children to produce a book to memorialize the collective experience of the summer. And this actually is my own copy. A lot of people, when they emigrated, brought this with them because it meant so much to them. So I purchased this copy used in the US. Shortly after the advent of Nazi rule at the end of January 1933, Grune moved to Berlin to live more openly as a gay man in a city where homosexuality was still illegal under German law, but nevertheless a lively gay scene thrived. He worked on an anti-Nazi newspaper called Kurze Pause, short break. He managed to escape detection for these sort of resistant activities. And yet, he was arrested in December of 1934, not for his anti-Nazi work, but specifically for being gay. Convicted as a homosexual under paragraph 175, Grune would spend the next 10 years, the full remaining period of Nazi rule, almost entirely in prisons and concentration camps. It is extremely unusual for anyone to survive in concentration camps for as long as Grune did. Hence the socialism, but also the SS. Flossenburg, where Grune spent the last 5 years of the Nazi period, was a forced labor camp with a stone quarry where known gay inmates were routinely given the most brutal and deadliest work. But Grune worked instead in the painting studio, or painting commando. Together with other imprisoned artists, he made children's books for the camp's overseer, and he almost certainly made the kitschy paintings favored by members of the SS, who liked such works even more when they were more or less free. Grune's work from Flossenburg's painting studio has not survived, at least not images we know of. picture. I imagine they're in some basement somewhere. But we do have direct testimony from the Austrian graphic designer Hugo Wallleitner, who also worked there. In 1941, he, like Grune, was arrested and imprisoned for homosexuality. In 1942, he also was transferred to Flossenbürg and the painting studio Commando. And he also survived. In 1946, Wallleitner published his livid illustrated account of his suffering in the concentration camp in a book titled Zebra for the striped uniforms the inmates were forced to wear. On one page, Wallleitner depicts his bewilderment at being brought to the painting studio to work. It was much safer than working in the quarry, but any contact with the SS was dangerous, as the billy club held by one of the guards on the left makes clear. The other guard holds up a picture of Wallleitner's that it has a church in it, he recounts, which made the SS mad because they were anti-Christian. They had their own religion. So that guard is tearing that picture and wants him instead to depict the castle, which is in the background. Paintings made in this studio of precisely this scene, the famed local Bavarian castle of Flossenbürg, do survive. Here on the right is a work produced in that studio by another prisoner, the Czech painter and anti-fascist František Michal, who recalled working for the Nazis as if on an assembly line to produce these kitschy, romanticized pictures. Grune, too, likely was forced to recreate the landscape of Flossenbürg as a kind of sunny paradise. Only later would he get the chance to freely express what life in Flossenbürg had, in his eyes, really been. Grune experienced the last days before the liberation of Flossenbürg terribly weak and sick, and clung to life by drawing. He later claimed that he held on to life in part because he wanted to witness Hitler's defeat. He was among the Flossenbürg prisoners sent on a forced so-called death march, this one to the Baltic Sea in April of 1945, during which time he managed to escape. He made it home to Kiel in the northwest of Germany and the care of his sister, broken but still drawing. Already upon his return, he started work on a series of lithographs that was published in full 2 years later under the title The Passion of the 20th Century. The title gestures to the traditions of Christian passion narratives showing the events at the end of Christ's life and representing his suffering and death. In its traditional form, the Passion story offers redemption through Christ's suffering, but that is largely not the case in Grune's pictures. They show a world of sheer brutality that, as in the case of the cruel SS guard taunting a starving prisoner in one, or in others where they're being just simply tortured or forced to labor, these border on caricature. But Grune aims his picture stylization as a force to convey the horrors of the camps to the broad audience he sought, viewers who, in 1945, were incredulous and often disbelieving of the degree of systemized cruelty that existed in the camps. Further pictures from the series show the prisoners tending their dead and, at the right, living as a similar pile of bodies in the barracks. If Grune's Passion series has any compassion or redemption in it, it is the care and camaraderie among the inmates, themes he had first depicted in his Sachsenhausen songbook. One of his lithographs at the far left on this slide shows hanged prisoners against a wintry sky as their bodies are being lovingly taken down from the scaffold by their fellow prisoners. In 1946, Grune's sister helped him to prepare a traveling exhibition of these pictures in order to show the German public the horrors of the camps that he had barely survived, but which had claimed the lives of so many others, including Alice Glaser and Lotte Rothschild. Among other locations, the exhibition was shown in Nuremberg, in a building quite close to the location where the International Military Tribunal was sitting in judgment on senior Nazi politicians and military leaders. Not everyone wanted to see what Grune felt compelled to show. On the evening of March 31st, 1946, in a gallery in Kiel to which the show had traveled, the gallery was burglarized and the pictures destroyed. Fortunately, this time Grune didn't only draw his pictures, he made them as lithographs, which are printed as multiples. The three designers I've discussed in my talk this evening never made it into mainstream histories of the Bauhaus. Two of them were dead, and thus not part of any legacy-making projects for the school. The third, Grune, survived, but he was still considered a criminal under West German law, where paragraph 175 was in force until the 1990s. He never received apology or any compensation, and in fact, he was arrested again for his homosexuality. Yet history should not be told only by the survivors. In fact, the histories that are missing from the record are often as significant and meaningful as those that are usually told. Often creative people have been written out of history precisely when they've been victims of great crimes, prejudice, wars, and genocide that have taken them from us and destroyed much of, or all of their work. The material traces of the lives and work of Alice Glaser, Lotte Rothschild, and Richard Grune are scant. But even with these limited traces, clearly there are ways to bring their stories to light. Their objects carry Bauhaus art and design to extreme ends in the love offered in the card game, the safety given through the forged document, or the freedom and community in the songbook. Expanding our historical field of view to include these objects allows us to see what Bauhaus looks like under duress. Additionally, examining these three designers together gives us a fresh look at Bauhaus in the hands of a new cast of characters. Alice Glaser comes to light as the multi-talented artist and mother who took her child with her to the Bauhaus. Lotte Rothschild manifests as a young female metal designer and actor who founded a family, worked as a translator, and made an art of hiding in plain sight for as long as she could. And we see Richard Grune as a gay graphic designer who survived by making kitschy paintings for the SS, but who also brought music and pictures to his friends and escaped from the harrowing life of the camps. Excavating these stories and considering them as part of Bauhaus history constitutes the beginning of an answer to the prejudice and violence that have until now rendered these Bauhaus artists and designers largely silent. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
First, thank you so much. I was really struck by these examples where you were talking about relationships with the families and descendants of these people, and I wanted to know more about what it means to kind of connect with people in the present day and how that's kind of taking a role in your project as you're writing this book.
Yeah, thanks. That's been a real surprise pleasure of this project, and it has to be done carefully. I think talking with Alice Glaser's granddaughter in particular, well, all of it's been extraordinary in different ways, but we had such a great, we only ever talk on Google Hangouts is what it's called, right? That's what she likes. And we started talking still during the pandemic. And we had such a great time talking. She'd set it up for an hour, but she called me back and and I was going to be in DC at the Holocaust Museum. And she was like, you should live with me the whole time. She lives in the suburbs. And I was like, wow. And so I said, are there any objects? And she described this card game. And relatively far into it, I said, can I see it? And she got sort of thoughtful and she said, I don't know. And I was like, wow. And so we talked about other stuff. And afterwards I was like, I can't see it. Like that, as someone who's used to, I get to see the stuff, I had to sit with that and realize that's fine. there's stuff I don't get to see. There's stuff nobody gets to see. There are religious objects, there are family objects. But she wanted to keep talking, and we kept talking, and so we talked it through. And I was like, you don't have to show me this. We can just keep talking. I'll make notes. And it's like this whole little corner of like all the people Alice Glaser knew and different Bauhaus members. But at a certain point, I said, if you would like to show it to the world, I can tell her story. Without an object, it's really hard. And I said, but it's okay. And she finally said, I don't, my mother would think it's fine to show this. I just feel protective of it, but I want you to tell her story. So that's how that unfolded. With Lotte Rothschild, so her oldest daughter was murdered, but she had two surviving children, and that's been also really great. Just such an amazing, like, she has this also amazing female line. Then she has their great granddaughters now too, and so that's been fun. Like, we've really become good friends. And it's funny because I am vegan, and the last time I got there, she was like, it's snowing, I made a chicken, and I was like, great. So I ate the chicken. um, but just to, like, have people who have firsthand documents, learn about their families, learn about, what was passed on to them, what was kept from them. For example, so Lotte Rothschild's husband was angry at Germany his whole life, but I know he was shown that photograph of them, where she's leaning on them. A photo archivist told me she showed him that photograph once. He came to the Bauhaus archive as an old man, and he burst into tears and said she was the love of my life. So we get different perspectives, but he felt, I think, guilty his whole life, but he never would tell who that person was who gave up Lotte Rothschild, because he was insistent that, this was a terrible situation. It was an unwinnable situation. We can't, so um, what people choose to share and choose not to. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but man, has this been a totally different kind of research than I'm used to doing, that involves living people and ethics and thinking about what's right for them, what's kind for them, as well as to those, who were murdered. I advocate for them, but I can't, I would never advocate against what their family feels is right too. Even if I feel like we should know them, not everybody is going to be known, and that's okay too.
Question here and then.
First of all, thank you so much for your work. And then I can't remember if you said it at the beginning, if this was just an example or if your book focuses on these three people. My question is, like, how did you choose who you would focus on? Was it a matter of where you could find any information, or, how did you make your selection? Did you start with the, I don't know, enrollment sheets from the Bauhaus to sort of go through all the people who passed through there, or just, I'm interested in that process.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'd be happy to talk about that. Let me just see where, whoops. Let me just go down to the slide I want, and then I'll turn this back on. So that, what I just presented are kind of highlights from one chapter. This book, this is one of those books, there's always like somebody who's always writing their book, and like, it's been 30 years, and I'm not going to let that happen to this book. But it's hard sometimes to select. So that those three people are a chapter for me, with a lot of footnotes, but then there's some people, like, I found a couple of people who were in hiding. I don't know where I'm going to put them, but they made work while they were in hiding. One woman made a children's book. Paul Citroën, the Dutch artist, made really interesting paintings. So somewhere they have to be in there. So the way I have it set up is kind of by medium and kind of by theme. This is, at least in my mind, at least. Oh gosh, boy, do I wish I had a laser pointer. Does anyone? Oh, here it is. They have a new laser pointer. They were like, please use our laser pointer. Oh yeah, here. So one chapter deals with propaganda exhibitions. We all often people know about degenerate art, and Bauhaus members were included in those, but they also were in the propaganda exhibition called the Great German Art Show that happened every year. So there were 7 Bauhaus members who participated in those. So again, I'm interested in, yes, some of the narratives we have are true, but it's way more complicated. They really played along. The second chapter, which a couple of you maybe heard, I did a works in progress here internally yesterday, is about home and kind of interior design and ideas about home. And that also goes into a concentration camp because a Bauhaus member named Franz Ehrlich was imprisoned in Buchenwald and survived by becoming like the house designer for the SS and designing all these leisure spaces. Yeah, it's totally weird. Like the commandant's house and all the furniture, all kinds of stuff. So then there's probably a chapter on propaganda. We'll see. I might, yeah. And then monumental architecture is a place where actually Bauhaus looking architecture kind of survives because flat roofs were considered appropriate. So Walter Gropius tried to design for the regime just because, he wanted to employ his people. Mostly people talk about like he left. He did leave eventually, but he designed for the regime. And one of his students designed, major factories where forced laborers were working, and he knew it. And this is Ernst Neufert, who, totally just was he never had any trouble for what he did. Yeah. Oh, this is an example of Franz Ehrlich's work in Buchenwald. This thing just makes me like violently angry. Like, why do you have a lamppost inside? It's so kitschy. But you can see the furniture is like somewhat modern. So this is the missing archive, just gesturing to that. There's a chapter on photography. So again, sometimes it's by movement or by medium rather. So I talk about some propaganda photographers, but also Willy Jongmetag, that photographer who did the picture of the baby that I showed you, who ended up going into active resistance, and Fritz Heinze, who was also in the resistance. He was imprisoned and he was in a prison and also in a concentration camp called Kolditz, and ended up in something called the Landesschützen, which were a division of the Wehrmacht that usually didn't carry weapons. They were considered not necessarily trustworthy politically, but they still served. So he was guarding prisoners, and he took photographs, including this one, which documents women and children being held in a greenhouse before their murder the next day. So, a lot of the material is just incredibly fraught, incredibly sensitive. And I think thinking about this, it's so sensitive that I think we tend to just not talk about it. But there is this thing in the Bauhaus that anything you do, you're using your Bauhaus skills. It doesn't need to look a certain way. It's not a style, it's an approach. So I think we do need to bring it back into the movement. And the final chapter, at least in my head right now, although I've written a piece of it at least, is about an alternative legacy that I see coming out of the Bauhaus, which is about not just teaching and style, but care and nurturing. So Friedel Dicker Brandeis ended up in Theresienstadt, ghetto concentration camp, and taught 500 students, children, using, among other skills, her Bauhaus skill set to kind of give them hope, help them escape from their bleak everyday, and to continue studying in a way too. It was a kind of informal schooling. And she also was murdered at Auschwitz, but two of her students actually survived and came to the United States. And one of them helped found the art therapy movement at NYU. That's Edith Kramer, who's a New York-based artist. And there are a couple cases like that where there are these things like art therapy. There's also art therapists in the UK, some of whom were Bauhaus trained, or children's toys for handicapped children that haven't been seen as a part of this movement but do belong to it. So that was a very long answer, but as you can, I think it gives you a sense maybe of like the choices I'm trying to make so that we get a sense. I'm really interested in how, people made compromises or were even Nazis or were victims, and that it's almost like a core sample in a tree. Like what happens when a group of people who all have the same thing important, because choosing to go to the Bauhaus was a big deal. It was very progressive. So what happens when these people are put into this situation? What do they do? What can they do? And so that's what I want to look at.
Freya, you had a question.
First of all, Libby, just thank you so much. This was really fascinating, and I've known about parts of this book, and it's really just to see you kind of give us an overview of this chapter is really what's really moving, and it's really fascinating. And I think but I guess it's a question and a comment in very academic form. Um, it picks up on what RJ was asking about and what you've mentioned too, that there was no Bauhaus style, even though even though that's sort of the legacy of the Bauhaus in popular thought now, that you mention the Bauhaus and you think of tubular steel furniture, and but I was very, very struck with Richard Grune's style, his style of drawing. And I think it's so beautiful the way that it begins in your talk with the songbook. And I was struck by that image in the invitation to the talk. And I think there's something very, very interesting to me about the way that motion goes throughout these lines. Like his way of drawing, it's all about motion, and even the bodies that are still and even the bodies that are dead are somehow in motion.
Yeah.
And I think also that when we see these bodies, these persecuted bodies, these bodies that are emaciated, there's something very strong and noble, and they take up space. And I think that's really interesting because we've all seen probably photographs of these things, and we've seen other renderings of them. And this thing you said, I mean, I suppose it's resonating with me right now, but that he wanted to stay alive to see Hitler get his just desserts, and I feel like there's something about that sense of like life force and will that I see in the drawings. And I'm wondering, the question then, after all that long-winded stuff, is how do you deal with, I mean, how do you approach this, maybe the question of aesthetics, when so much of this, maybe you don't have very much to go on, or maybe you don't have anything to go on, is the kind of the meaning of the work as aesthetic work also something that finds its way into how you're thinking about this stuff?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think it's funny because with Grune, I see that too, but I don't think I've really talked to another art historian much about these works. Like I mean, I always, like, what is in my head is Grune has such a strong hand. Like it's like seeing somebody's face. You recognize his hand anywhere. But I haven't thought about how to articulate it. But it's, yeah, like you say, it's almost rhythmic. It's like in motion and it's very rhythmic, which also there are, like, that's interesting because there were these Itten taught these motion drawing things where you just would like loosen up your spirit by like drawing circles, and there are videos of Edith Kramer teaching that, having learned it from Friedel Dicker, who was like a disciple of Itten. So we have like these testaments of what it was like as a process, and with his, I always think of that, like his, like, you can almost see him in motion when you see these. But that's something I think about a lot with, like, I always feel like I have to step over a threshold to start reading these works because they're so fraught, and it feels a little precarious when I do it because they're, I mean, especially like reading a ration book. I didn't intensely read those, but in some of my writing, I've done more about that, how it functioned, and or reading like the cards. I think it was really, when I was reading them, I was like, some of them are good and some of them are really stiff. Why would they be stiff? And I was like, oh, because she's looking at books. And in fact, one of them is she's looking at well, not to get, yeah, she was looking at a sculpture that they owned. That's what, like this one, this is from a René Sintonis sculpture that the family owns. That's what got me thinking about it. I was like, why would she's right by the zoo. Why would she draw a baby goat from a sculpture? Because it kind of looks like she did. It's a little bit blobby. Yeah. So with Grune, I don't know if that answers your question, but like the aesthetic, I feel like it's essential to treat them like artworks, especially when they are artworks, right? Like when they're documents, I guess I'm more interested in reading how they worked in the bureaucracy, because that's what they are. It was only over time that I was like, wait, these are all works on paper, and that makes so much sense in terms of what people could get their hands on, and in terms of how Nazis loved paper. There was so much paper. There were so many archives. Auschwitz, a lot was destroyed, but a lot, like the entire architecture archive survived because there were so many other documents they had to destroy that they forgot about that. So there's been some really good work looking at what kinds of forced labor were being done in terms of building and unbuilding and rebuilding and changing things just in Auschwitz. I feel like there's the aesthetic dimension is essential, but it takes.
I mean, it's just fascinating to do. I mean, I think it's also a bigger question of like, how does an art historian or a design historian do this kind of work, and what's different as doing it as an art historian than doing it as a cultural historian or a social historian.
Yeah,
I mean, and I think that's what's so fascinating to me about. And as you say, I think the way you express it about stepping over a threshold, that's how it feels, right? I get that it's kind of a, you're not passing judgment, and so you're doing a bit of a dance, which is really interesting.
Yeah, well, and that it's important for us to do what, like, I sometimes, I've done a ton of homework to be like really clear on what happened when in Nazi history. My husband is here, and I do a lot of audiobooks, and so our child would like wander in, and I'd be listening to like a complete history of the concentration camps, just because I want to know that literature, and to get it right, to know what it means for something or someone existing in 1938 versus 1942. And I also work really closely with Holocaust historians, but then to go back and be like, but also we have a particular calling and set of techniques, and those have to be in play as well.
Any other questions? Back here, and then
after. Thank you. This is really very fascinating and, disturbing in the ways that it should be and all of that. I wonder, did you come across in your research generally, not just with these people, but anyone feeling a sense of resistance against the Bauhaus because of the history? In other words, it was their kind of their training and their artistic and ideological heritage, but that it was also tinged with the sense of the role that the Bauhaus did play inevitably in the ways that you've shown in Nazi propaganda and things like that. So in other words, people who it was a source of pride, but also a source of conflict. Because that's, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. The main thing that, so in German history, there's been, and just the way things have unfolded, there's been a real wish for there to be something that sometimes gets called the good Germany and the good Germans. And so what other scholars have worked on and documented well, but I still see it playing out, is that things from the 1920s, like the Bauhaus, and definitely including the Bauhaus, get kind of bracketed off as if that's part of the reason that everybody loves this story, that like, they were all fantastic and they saw Nazism for what it was and they had nothing to do with it. Their souls are pure. They left for the US. And so then in 2019, which was the Bauhaus centenary, the government put up millions of euros. I benefited from this partially because I curated a show with some friends to celebrate the centenary of the Bauhaus, because the Bauhaus is good Germany. It's the 1920s and that's it. 1933 it ends. And we know that that really wasn't true. So that's the main thing I'm pushing against. There are cases like Herbert Bayer, who ended up coming to the U.S. And actually made propaganda for the U.S. government. There, he made propaganda for the Nazi government. He was not at all ideologically convinced, but he needed to work. He was married to a Jewish woman and they liked his style, and he was a gun for hire and had no scruples. So, I think that's where the nuance comes in. I know when I first saw some of the work he did in 1938, I judged him and thought, that he was just simply morally despicable. It didn't occur to me that, for example, it wasn't that easy to leave. I mean, like, we all have this fantasy. I don't know. I mean, people are talking about it now. Some people are like, how do I go? Where would I go? And then, it's not like, you usually have your life, your friends, your family. So I think just kind of, it's not my role to like condemn or forgive anyone, but to understand the nuances means a lot to me. I started working on this project when family separation was first happening here. And, I was aghast. And I didn't do anything. I mean, I think I wrote an email. So I think on the ground, you can not like something or even be completely horrified, but actually making positive change is very difficult. So
Yeah, thanks. I mean, can I say one more thing really quickly?
sure.
I think that your characterization of the way that the family of Alice Glaser was reluctant to share her work, and then over time she trusted you and she wanted you to see it, is I have my own family history that's very similar to this. So the kind of reluctance to tell a story, and then over time you realize the value of telling the story. But I think that was beautifully played out in the way you dealt with this, and I think that whatever you publish, that should be part of the story, because it's amazing, even though it's more like on the anecdotal side of like how you got the story. But the whole way that people resist telling the story until they feel that it's going to be worthwhile in some way.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was really, it was an extraordinary experience as a scholar to realize, like, just chill out. Like, it's fine if you never see it. So, excuse me. Yeah, I think I may take your advice. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much. It was really fascinating, especially broadening my idea of what can be understood as Bauhaus design. I was interested, since you curated exhibition on Bauhaus, if you could talk about to what degree also museums and institutions are now starting to collect or integrating these more private objects, memorabilia, into their collections, into their narratives of Bauhaus. If that's something that's happening at the moment.
Yeah, so all of the works I talked about, except for the Richard Grune lithographs, they're all in private collection. No, actually, Richard Grune, the songbook, is in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp archive. So it's still like Bauhaus in general. It's so eclectic. You were at the session that I did. I've got a slide. Actually, I probably have it here somewhere. Of the all the workshops and programs. So, it was photography. Let me just see if it's here. Photography, weaving, architecture, ceramics. Here. This is a graph that breaks down male and female members of the different workshops and programs at the Bauhaus. So the little black bars, mostly little except for weaving, are female members, and the gray are male members of these workshops over time. So this is how we know about the 1,200 odd Bauhaus students. But what's important also in this is if people know that there are women in the Bauhaus, often they think they were all forced into the weaving workshop. And you can see a lot of them were in weaving, but they were in every single program and workshop. So the Bauhaus was so eclectic that institutions that collect Bauhaus are used to collecting a lot of different kinds of things. The photographs of the prisoners in the greenhouse, that's been interesting too, because once we put that very small, it's a contact print, in our exhibition, and one family member, a grandson, has been taking care of the archive. He says, it actually belongs to my uncle, but I have it here, and he's done research. He makes it accessible to people. I went to his house, and another, his sister, who cannot stand him, found out about this, and suddenly she, discovered her love of her grandfather's archive. And meanwhile, the son or the uncle, depending on your perspective, is in his 90s. He's blind, and he's trying to navigate this family drama. And I'm like, oh God, I just want to see them. Like, someone, so I wrote and said, he's made it accessible to everyone. It's been really great. The grandson has. You could also give it to an institution if you wanted to, just so it's accessible to everyone. But I end up drawing on the German Historical Museum, for example, has tons and tons and tons of stuff, including war propaganda art that I look at, or paintings that belong to Hitler. Hitler actually owned 2 Bauhaus paintings, technically speaking. They don't look, one is a portrait of his favorite pianist, and the other is a portrait of, or a painting of a sailor that was gifted to him. But one he actually purchased a work by a Bauhaus member that we could arguably call a Bauhaus work. So yeah, it's I think the challenge for museums is ongoing. We know that institutions are always offered much more than they're able to collect. I think they always have to consult their internal missions. And for a project like this, you just have to be willing to forage very freely, and see what you come up with.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And please join me in thanking Elizabeth Otto.